All right. It looks like I'm live. Let's see here. Okay, so before anyone joins, my name's Alex, and I'm an English teacher. And this stream is an experiment. I have a student here who wants to discuss this book with me. Here I have it in Polish. It's Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Uh, Paul Kennedy is a British historian, and because my student wanted to read this book together, and it's as you can see here, it's 700 plus pages, so it's not something we'll be able to do during our lessons, right? So I thought that maybe what I could do is live stream myself uh, reading this book or reading excerpts from this book. Mm, and explaining the more difficult words in it. Yeah. So here I'll be reading the introduction to this book and just some highlights, some parts I highlighted that I thought got to the main point of the book. Yeah. And for those people who are wondering, why would someone want to read this book, this monstrosity, 700 some pages here? The translation, at least, is over 800 pages. Well, supposedly this book was written in the late 1980s, before the fall of the Soviet Union, and the author's claim thesis was that military power followed economic power. Yeah, and at the time, he was looking at the Soviet Union and its relative decline in its economic power and the relative rise of uh, Europe, Japan, China, and saying that the current back then, what back then was like the current, Soviet American rivalry, it wasn't something that was going to continue. Yeah, for a long time. And he turned out to be right. I don't know if that was a shocking thing to say back then. But then again, supposedly this book was very popular in Washington, D.C. at the time. So supposedly powerful and influential people were reading this book, getting some knowledge from this book. Yeah. So at least it can help us think or help us analyze what powerful and influential people are reading and what they're thinking. And another thing to remember is that Paul Samuelson, I mean, uh, very mainstream economist, one of the most mainstream of the mainstream economists. I think in 1989, he predicted that the Soviet Union would uh, become more powerful, economically outpace the United States, which was a pretty bad time to make that prediction. Yeah. I mean, a couple of years before the fall of the Soviet Union. And of course, well, later that year, what was it? The Berlin Wall fell. Mm, Poland also had its solidarity and all of that. Hi, Islam. So at least I have one student here of mine. Okay. So, in any case, let's maybe, since it's already 9 a.m., I'll just quickly tell my students I'm live. One second. We're going to jump into the book itself. All right. Oops. All right. Now let me see. Share my screen here. Window. Okay. I gave you guys some info about this book, about the author, Paul Kennedy, British historian. Book was written at the end of the 80s. Mm. And let's jump into this. The introduction really will go over a lot of the things that I already mentioned. So, this is a book about national and international power in the modern, that is, post Renaissance period. It seeks to trace and to explain how the various great powers have risen and fallen relative to each other over the 5 centuries since the formation of the new monarchies of Western Europe and the beginnings of the transoceanic global system of states. Okay, so here the author is telling us very briefly what the book is going to be about and what he wants to do, yeah? So the book seeks to trace and to explain how the various great powers have risen and fallen relative to each other. Yeah, so it seeks to trace. To seek means to want to do something. Yeah, here. And to trace means to follow it. Yeah, so if we want to trace, for example, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union slash Russia, right? That means we're looking at it through history. We're tracking it through history, right? Oh, I see Sonia and Pavo joined. Hello, hello. And the various great powers. I know a lot of people learning English have a problem with this word. Various means many different. Yeah, so they want to look and follow the many different great powers and how they've risen and fallen relative to each other, right? And so that's going to be important in this book. And he goes on through the coalitions, international order, the global economic balances, and going on. What it concentrates upon is the interaction between economics and strategy, as each of the leading states in the international system strove to enhance its wealth and its power to become or to remain both rich and strong. Okay, so strove is a past tense of strive. Yeah, like if you're striving to do something, you are trying to do something, right? You're fighting to do something. Okay, like I don't know, I can strive to become rich, for example, or strive to be a better person, for example, right? So here, this book concentrates upon the interaction between economics and strategy, as these states, as these governments, as these countries wanted to enhance their wealth and power. Yeah, so to enhance means to like make better or make stronger. Okay, to become or remain both rich and strong. Yeah, so I think that's all clear here. And by the way, since I already have some of you in the live chat, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and ask in the chat. I'll be checking from time to time. Anything about words, or if you have any thoughts about what the author says here. Okay. So the author keeps on going and he mentions technology, right? So first we saw he mentioned military power and economic power. Yeah. And he also focuses here on the relative very much. Yeah. It's not so much, am I richer than I was before, but it's more so, am I richer than my neighbor, right? And technology can change that. And here we see it in this paragraph where he says how technological change doesn't affect everyone the same. For example, the coming of the long range gun sailing ship and the rise of the Atlantic trades after 1500 was not uniformly beneficial to all the states of Europe. It boosted some much more than others. In the same way, the later development of steam power and of the coal and metal resources upon which it relied massively increased the relative power of certain nations and thereby decreased the relative power of others. Okay? So, what is he saying here? That the gun sailing ship and the Atlantic trade did not uniformly benefit all the states of Europe. So it didn't benefit all of the countries of Europe the same. It wasn't uniform, right? It boosted some much more than others. So it helped, it supported to boost some much more than others. And for example, well, how did this, technological change help some more than others? Well, if you had coal, you were in luck, right? Because coal all of a sudden became important and valuable, right? He doesn't mention it here, but I think another clear one is if you had great access to the Atlantic, like a Portugal, Spain, France, the UK, you also were in luck. If you didn't, like Germany, kind of not really, Austria, Hungary, kind of not really, maybe you weren't in the best position, right? To actually benefit from this. Let's keep on going. Oops, there we go. He goes on to say here that obviously economic strength helps with military strength, yeah, and military strength is how you grow your country. If, however, too large a proportion of the state's resources is diverted from wealth creation and allocated instead to military purposes, then that is likely to lead to a weakening of national power over the longer term. In the same way, if a state overextends itself strategically by, say, the conquest of extensive territories or the waging of costly wars, it runs the risk that the potential benefits from external expansion may be outweighed by the great expense of it all, a dilemma which becomes acute if the nation concerned has entered a period of relative economic decline. Okay, so what is the author saying here? If too many resources are diverted from wealth creation, so if they're diverted, that means kind of like taken away from wealth creation and allocated instead to military purposes. So here, let's say if they're taken away from wealth creation and given to the military, then that is likely to lead to a weakening of national power over the longer term. I think that makes intuitive sense to us all. Yeah, if you take too much away from the economy and give too much to the military, maybe you'll be strong for a couple of years, but eventually the economy will be burdened and go bankrupt or get weaker relatively, right? That's one of the things that happened to the Soviet Union. In the same way, if a state overextends itself strategically, yeah, so remember, extend in English means like to make longer, yeah, like I'm extending my arm right now. So if a state, if a country overextends, if it gets too big, yeah, strategically, by say the conquest of extensive territories or the waging of costly wars, so the conquest of extensive territories, yeah, conquering many different areas, or waging, so that means leading costly, expensive wars. It runs the risk that the potential benefits from external expansion may be outweighed by the great expense of it all. The benefits of conquering new places may uh, uh, the potential benefits from external expansion may be outweighed by the great expense of it all. Yeah, so the potential benefits, money you get, yeah, resources you get, etc., from expanding could be outweighed by the great expense of it all. So the costs could be greater than the benefits, is what he's saying here. A dilemma which becomes acute if the nation concerned has entered a period of relative economic decline. So this is something that becomes acute. How to explain that? Uh, Particularly stressful in a point of time. Yeah. So this could become like a very serious problem, is what he's arguing, if the country is already in a period of relative economic decline. Yeah. So think of the United States right now. Mm, It's doing pretty well economically, you could say, but relatively, is it so good? Well, China's rising. Yeah, so relatively, America's not doing great. Or look at Europe. Relatively, it's doing even worse economically. Yeah, in terms of GDP numbers, at least, right? So if Europe were to overextend strategically, that could be a big problem. I think that that's what we could take from what the author is saying here. So let's keep on going. He's just explaining what will be later in this book. He looks at different power centers around 500, Ming China, the Ottoman Empire, and its Muslim offshoot in India. Yeah, so the Ottoman Empire, that's Turkey today, right? And its Muslim offshoot in India, the Mughal Empire, Muscovy, Tokugawa, Japan, and the cluster of states in West Central Europe. Yeah, so a cluster is like a group. So the group of different countries in West Central Europe. At the beginning of the 16th century, it was by no means apparent that the last named region was destined to rise above all the rest. So it wasn't apparent, it wasn't clear that this last region, West Central Europe, would rise above all the rest, that would become more powerful, right? But however imposing and organized some of these Oriental empires appeared by comparison with Europe, they all suffered from the consequences of having a centralized authority which insisted upon a uniformity of belief and practice, not only in official state religion, but also in such areas as commercial activities and weapons development. Okay, so however imposing, so imposing almost means like impressive, yeah? Like you're wow, what a imposing, like big, scary empire. So however imposing and organized some of these Oriental empires. Oriental is just an older word, let's say, used for East Asian, essentially, or Asian, really, in this context. So, however imposing these Asian empires appeared by comparison with Europe, they all suffered from the consequences of having a centralized authority. So, those countries were too centralized. Yeah, one emperor, one king had all the power. Whereas in Europe, you had many different countries competing with each other. Yeah, you also had different religions. Yeah, he says here that these Asian countries had a centralized authority which insisted upon a uniformity of belief and practice. So everyone would have to have uniform, the same belief and practice, right? Like in, for example, the Ottoman Empire, uh, you should be Muslim there. Yeah. Of course, no one, as far as I know, no one was forced to convert, but you didn't have like a Protestant, Prussia, Catholic Bavaria or Austria, and so on, yeah, competing with each other. Not only in official state religion, but also in areas as such areas as commercial activities and weapons development. Yeah. So he's talking not only about state religion, but also in economic and technological development. Goes on to say Europe benefited from all of this competition. Uh, Goes on to mention Austria Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Habsburg monarchies also in Spain. And why did this Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg monarchies fail? And he mentions that despite the great resources possessed by the Habsburg monarchs, they steadily overextended themselves in the course of repeated conflicts and became militarily top heavy for their weakening economic base. Okay, so here he highlights what we just read earlier a couple of minutes ago. Yeah, that they had great resources, right? They had great resources, but they steadily overextended themselves. Yeah, so over time, steadily over time, they grew too large. Okay, and in the course of repeated conflicts, became militarily top heavy. Right, so they were too top heavy, too much focus on the military, compared to their weakening economic base. Yeah, so their economy was weakening, too much was going to the military, and they overextended. Okay. Mm. He goes on to mention France, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, how they dominated 18th century Europe. And again, here we're returning to technology and the economy. And let's look at this highlighted part here. Since the cost of standing armies and national fleets had become horrendously great by the early 18th century, a country which could create an advanced system of banking and credit, as Britain did, enjoyed many advantages over financially backward rivals. But the factor of geographical position was also of great importance in deciding the fate of the powers in their many and frequently changing contests, which helps to explain why the two flank nations of Russia and Britain had become much more important by 1815. Both retained the capacity to intervene in the struggles of West Central Europe while being geographically sheltered from them, and both expanded into the extra European world as the 18th century unfolded, even as they were ensuring that the continental balance of power was upheld. So this is actually not the point about technology. Sorry, that'll be later. What he's saying here is, no, yeah, kind of actually. So first, he's mentioning here the financial system. Yeah, so because it costs so much to have a standing army, so that's an army that's always there. Okay, Britain, which developed some advanced finances, let's say banking and credit, uh, had some advantages in actually financing their standing military. Yeah, like the military that is professional, right? But he says here the factor of geographical position. Yeah, so where you are geographically was also of great importance. Okay, and Britain and Russia here are these two flank nations. Yeah, so these two nations on the side that were important. Why? Because they could intervene in Europe and then they could also grow outside of Europe, right? Russia, obviously, basically all of Asia, right? All of Siberia and all of that stuff, right? Uh, the UK, Britain, I mean, it's obvious. America, Canada, right? Australia, South Africa, these were all British colonies, right? So their access to the sea definitely helps them. And uh, that's why they were also able to play in Europe. And this is something that helped them. And this extra European, this extra means outside of Europe. Yeah. So they both expanded into the extra European world outside of Europe. Okay. Mm. Going back to the technological point, uh, he says the few major conflicts of this era, so he's talking about this age of European empires, the few major conflicts of this era, the Crimean War to some degree, but more especially the American Civil War and the Franco Prussian War, were bringing defeat upon these societies which failed to modernize their military systems and which lacked the broad based industrial infrastructure to support the vast armies and much more expensive and complicated weaponry, now transforming the nature of war. Okay? I think here everything should be clear to you guys. If it's not, then feel free to ask in the live chat. I'll just give some more context here. The American Civil War, why does he mention that, right? It was the industrial North, which could produce weapons, which could produce rifles and cannons and things like this, versus the agrarian, that means farm based, agricultural South. Yeah, what did the South had? It had aristocrats, slave owners, and slaves working cotton fields. Yeah, you're not going to win a war with cotton fields. Uh, the North had lots of people, many immigrants also, uh, and lots of factory workers. And you can draft those people, send them to war, but they also produce things like weapons, like clothing, food that you need for an army. Yeah. So this is his point here. societies which failed to modernize their military systems and which lacked the broad-based industrial infrastructure they lacked, which means they didn't have these broad industrial infrastructures to support the vast armies. So vast means large, kind of like broad means wide, vast also kind of means wide. So really big industries, big armies. If you can't finance these things and support them with your industry, you're going to fail in war. Yeah. And that's what we saw in the Crimean War, in the American Civil War, and the Franco Prussian War. The more advanced industrial countries won in each of these, or at least fared better relatively. Uh, okay, he goes on here to mention some issues with like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, land-based empires. He goes on to mention America, yeah, the rise of America. Hold on, where do I have my next highlight here? Oh, there we go. And fast forwarding to more of the modern world, the 20th century, he's looking at the way things looked after World War II. Yeah. And he says here, the third world's share of total manufacturing output and GNP, depressed to an all-time low in the decade after 1945, has steadily expanded since that time. Okay. So he's saying the third world, right? So like Africa, much of Asia, Latin America, their total output, their total production of manufacturing goods and of GNP, that's the size of their economy, it was depressed to an all-time low. So it was at an all-time low in the decade after 1945. But it steadily expanded since that time. So it steadily got larger, year after year, got larger. Europe recovered from its wartime batterings. Yeah, to batter, it means to beat up. Yeah. Assault and battery is another way of saying like when you're attacked by someone. So Europe recovered from its wartime battering, yeah, from being beat up during World War II, and formed the European Economic Community. So that's the predecessor to the EU, the European Union. The People's Republic of China, yeah, Communist China, is leaping forward at an impressive rate. So it's growing, it's jumping, yeah, at an impressive rate. It's like, wow, impressive. Japan's post war economic growth has been so phenomenal that, according to some measures, it recently overtook Russia in total GNP. Okay. So it's been so phenomenal, so amazing that it recently overtook Russia in total GNP. So it got ahead of Russia. If it overtook Russia, it means Russia, let's say it's a race, Russia, Japan, and Japan is slowly overtaking Russia. Yeah, growing faster than Russia. By contrast, both the American and Russian growth rates have become more sluggish, and their shares of global production and wealth have shrunk dramatically since the 1960s. So, American and Russian growth rates have become more sluggish. So, they've slowed down. To be sluggish is to be kind of slow. If you wake up and don't drink coffee, at least if you're like me, you're a caffeine addict. If I don't drink coffee in the morning, I'm sluggish. Yeah, I can't move quickly. But if you drink some coffee, warm up, do some exercises, you're not sluggish anymore. And so the American and Russian growth rates became sluggish, and their relative share of global production shrunk. It got smaller since the 1960s. Yeah. So the author here is saying, like, this is the late 1980s, remember? The author here is saying that we already see other countries kind of catching up and getting ahead of the US and Russia. And he says, therefore, it is plain that there already exists a multipolar world once more if one measures the economic indices alone. Yeah, so a multipolar world with many different countries competing with each other. if you only look at the economic data, let's say, yeah, if one measures the economic indices alone, if you only look at the economics. Mm. And he continues here, China, Japan, Europe, the Soviet Union, the US, uh, with all of this struggle, all of this fighting struggle, yeah, we can see that what? The history of the rise and fall of the great powers has in no way come to a full stop. So he's saying this hasn't ended, yeah? And we can kind of compare this to this idea of the end of history, right? That was also popular at the time. He's saying there hasn't been an end of history, right? The struggle is continuing. All right, let's keep on going. Mm. Oh, here he says he doesn't look into things like Kondratiev cycles. Yeah, so like this theories of different cycles of upturns and downturns. He doesn't look into why empires become stronger, like how to build an empire. If you want that, read Michael Doyle's Empires. He's just looking more from the outside at the facts and how they correlate with each other. No super grand theories here, basically. Um, he goes on to say that uh, he doesn't look at it all deterministically. Yeah. So we can't say, for example, the American Revolutionary War happened because someone wanted to weaken Britain, right? Uh, so it's not deterministic. He's saying, okay, but economic shifts heralded the rise of the new great powers, which would one day have a decisive impact upon the military territorial order. This is why the move in the global productive balances towards the Pacific Rim, which has taken place over the past few decades, cannot be of interest merely to economists alone. Okay, so earlier in this paragraph, he was saying it's not deterministic necessarily, but it clearly influences it, right? And going back to the late 1980s when he was writing this, he's saying the move of production towards the Pacific Rim. So, the Pacific Ocean, yeah, the ocean between America, China, basically. And the move of production towards the rim. So those are the outer edges. Yeah. So towards what? Japan, South Korea, China, uh, maybe a little bit of Australia, Indonesia. Yeah. The move to these edges of the Pacific Rim, uh, that shouldn't be interesting merely to economists. Yeah, so only to economists. Okay, that's what he's saying here. And again, he highlights the point of it being relative. So far as the international system is concerned, both wealth and power are always relative and should be seen as such. Okay, so it's always not how rich am I now versus how rich I was last year. It's how rich am I compared to you. Yeah, if I'm richer compared to you, that means I can fund a bigger military compared to you. Uh, and here he highlights some German authors who made the same point. Here he says the Netherlands in the mid 18th century was richer in absolute terms than 100 years earlier, but by that stage was much less of a great power because neighbors like France and Britain had more of it, that is, more power and riches. So, highlighting this relative term, you can be rich more in absolute terms. I can have $1,000 versus $100, and that's nice. But if my neighbor has $1 million, it doesn't matter. Yeah, because they're relatively stronger. Mm. Here he also continues this line of thought, but with something interesting. This does not mean, however, that a nation's relative economic and military power will rise and fall in parallel. Yeah, so like at the same time, in parallel. Most of the historical examples covered here suggest that there is a noticeable lag time between the trajectory of a state's relative economic strength and the trajectory of its military territorial influence. Okay, so a lag, many of you might know this from playing internet games, right? A lag is when something happens sometime after. Yeah, like a lag on the internet means I say something and you hear it like 3 minutes later, right? uh, so there's a noticeable lag time, a lag time that you can notice, that you can see between how quickly a country's economy grows and their military influence. Yeah. So notice here that he was writing about China growing. He wrote this in the 1980s. And only now are we beginning to see like people a little worried about China militarily, right? It's been like 30, 40 years later, right? So these things don't travel together perfectly. It's usually the economy and then later the military follows, right? Uh, what does he say here? Once again, the reason for this is not difficult to grasp. An economically expanding power, Britain in the 1860s, the United States in the 1890s, Japan today, may well prefer to become rich rather than to spend heavily on armaments. Yeah. So you're saying if you're getting rich, you might want to focus on getting even richer versus on spending on the military. Let's keep on going. Mm. Oh, and he's talking about the fall of countries here. And in these more troubled circumstances, the great power is likely to find itself spending much more on defense than it did 2 generations earlier, and yet still discovered that the world is a less secure environment simply because other powers have grown faster and are becoming stronger. Yeah. So you're saying essentially, if you're a great power that's near its fall, you might be spending more and more on the military. Yeah. Uh, and simply because other powers have grown faster, right? So you're trying to keep up with them, and that can lead to your economic collapse. Here he says the same problem that will be argued below appears to be facing both the United States and the USSR today. Yeah, so it seems the Soviet Union is facing the same problem as is the US, the relative decline. Okay. If you guys have any thoughts, go ahead and share them in the chat because we're nearing the end of the introduction. So he goes on to say, one can make these generalizations, however, without falling into the trap of crude economic determinism. Yeah, so without falling into the trap of crude economic determinism. If something is crude, it's almost like simple or vulgar. Pavel says, you answer my questions before I even ask them. Yeah, I've been teaching English for a while. I almost always know which words people don't know. But that's good. That's good. If you have any questions, though, ask. Okay, so the trap of crude economic determinism. If something is crude, it's vulgar, it's simple. Yeah, so you're saying don't fall for this trap of determinism, of if one thing happens, then another thing has to happen. Despite this book's abiding interest in tracing the larger tendencies in world affairs over the past 5 centuries, it is not arguing that economics determines every event or is the sole reason for the success and failure of each nation. Yeah. So even though we're following these larger tendencies in world affairs, over the past 5 centuries or over the past 500 years, it is not arguing that economics determines every event or is the sole reason, is the only reason for success and failure. Yeah. So you're saying don't be deterministic about it. It's just one factor, essentially. Um, Here he goes on to say, there are other factors: geography, military organization, national morale, the alliance system, etc. Yeah. Mm. But he goes on to say, what does seem incontestable, so incontestable means something you can't contest, something you can't argue against. What does seem incontestable, or you could say inarguable, however, is that in a large, drawn out, great power and usually coalition war, victory has repeatedly gone to the side with the more flourishing, productive base. If something is drawn out, it's long. It's really long. Yeah. So he is kind of being repetitive here by saying long, drawn out. Yeah. So if we have like a very long great power war, maybe you could look at Russia versus Ukraine now as drawn out. Or you could definitely look at America and Afghanistan as drawn out. I mean, the US was there for 20 years. That's very drawn out. And here he says victory has repeatedly gone to the side with the more flourishing, productive base. To flourish means to prosper, to do very well. Yeah, if you're flourishing, your career is going well, you're healthy, yeah, your relationships are going well. And if you have as a country, a flourishing economic base, you have a profitable, successful, productive economic base. Yeah, everything's going well economically. So he says, when we have these long wars, the country with the more powerful economy does tend to win. Okay. Um, and I think that's it for the intro. That's good. This only took 30 minutes. I thought it would take longer. Uh, I don't know. If you guys have any thoughts about this, feel free to share. For me, I mean, I'd say this seems pretty obvious that the economy is important. Of course, it's not the only important thing, but it is one of the most important things for sure. I'm also glad he doesn't go into Kondratiev cycle, so these like big ideas of everything has to be cyclical in the world. Mm, so yeah, I think that'll be about it for today. Uh, I'll be speaking with my students here later. You can tell me if you liked it, if you disliked it, if we should continue doing this, and if you guys have any suggestions for what to read, that would also be nice. But since we don't have anyone sharing any questions or thoughts, I think that'll be it for today. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next week. Maybe we'll do the same thing next Saturday. We'll see. In any case, thanks. See you guys.